Okay, everybody, so we never got to finish our ecology student notes. So at this time, I want you to open your ecology student notes in Notability. I want you to split screen, and I want you to follow along with me. Right now, I am on slide 40, which I know we already went over, but I want to refresh your memory as to what an invasive species is. So remember, an invasive species is a living organism that is not native to an area and is causing an ecosystem harm. Remember, invasive species grow extremely rapidly, they reproduce very quickly, and they spread aggressively, harming the native species in that ecosystem. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, we talked about this local example, which was Elodia. Okay, go to the next slide. Remember, we talked about Elodia as a local example of an invasive species. Go to the next slide. Okay, next, we talked about how invasive species grow exponentially. And they grow this way because they are stealing resources from the native species. And this can pose a problem in the food web because it could decrease the number of native species there because the invasive species is stealing all the resources. We also talked about that invasive species can only grow exponentially because they have unlimited resources. And then I asked you if there were any other populations you knew about that might be growing exponentially. And we mentioned humans and bacteria. And in order for a population to grow exponentially, we mentioned that it had to have unlimited resources available. And then we talked about how invasive species grow exponentially. So populations that grow exponentially have a population curve that looks like the one you see in the image. We call this a J-shaped curve. Populations that grow exponentially are growing extremely rapidly. If the species is invasive, when they're growing rapidly, they're going to steal resources from native species. They could decrease the native species and the biodiversity of that ecosystem. And in order for a population to grow exponentially, they have to have unlimited resources. Also, something I don't think we talked about, but no predators. You might want to add that to your notes. And then we talked about populations besides invasive species that are normally growing exponentially. We mentioned humans and bacteria. All right, go to the next slide of your notes. So for a population to grow exponentially, they have to have no limiting factors. And a limiting factor is something that would keep a population from growing beyond the ability of the environment. So for example, some biotic limiting factors would be predators, disease, food. These are all limiting factors that would keep a population from growing exponentially. We also have abiotic limiting factors, things like pollution, temperature, precipitation, space would also be an abiotic limiting factor. So in an exponentially growing population, they do not have any limiting factors, which is why they're growing exponentially. Okay, go ahead to your slide. So exponential growth can only occur in conditions with no limiting factors. So in our invasive species example, or when we're talking about humans, there are no limiting factors present. This is why the population can grow exponentially. They have no limits. So again, we call that a J-shaped curve because the population is growing extremely rapidly. There are no limiting factors limiting their growth. Okay, now go on to the next slide. Most populations on the planet grow what's called logistically. A logistically growing population is the graph is going to look like the one you see in the image. You can see that at first they grow exponentially, but then you'll see it level off. The population will stop growing. So let's answer these questions. Why do you think a population would grow exponentially and then slow or stop growing? Well, the right answer here is because now the population has some limiting factors. All right, in the graph right here, you see the word carrying capacity. That is the point where this population levels off and reaches its maximum size. And why do we think that occurs in most populations? Because there is a natural population size for each ecosystem. So this particular population has reached its carrying capacity because that's naturally what the ecosystem can hold. There's enough resources for just that many people, so they've reached their maximum capacity. All right, and the last question says, if an invasive predator moved into this area, what do you think would happen to the population of the species to the left? So if all of a sudden the species shown in the graph had a new predator that was eating it, what would happen to its population? Well, it would definitely show a crash, a population crash, which would not be good for that specific species. Okay, so go to the next slide. So, logistically growing population is when population growth has either slowed or stopped, which is what you're seeing right there. It's leveling off because there are some type of limiting factors. So, limiting factors are present, which is why the population has reached carrying capacity. And carrying capacity is the amount of individuals an environment can reasonably hold. So, the carrying capacity for this particular population would be in that area that I'm highlighting right there. And we often call this an S-shaped curve because it is in the shape of kind of a funny S. Okay, go to the next slide. On this slide, you will see an example of a population that is growing logistically. We are looking at the population of flies, and then we're recording their population growth over 50 days. So I want you to look at the graph and I want you to try to figure out what is the carrying capacity of this population. So we're looking for the size of the population of flies where the growth kind of levels off and limiting factors are present. So pause the video now, try to find the carrying capacity, and then press play when you're done. Okay, so if you identified the carrying capacity, first of all, is right there. And if we follow that back to the y-axis, it looks like our carrying capacity is about 350 flies, or maybe just a little less than that. So population growth can be influenced by a variety of factors. How fast the birth rate and death rate are will influence the population growth, as well as both immigration and emigration. Immigration would be organisms migrating into a population, and emigration would be organisms leaving the population. All right, guys, thank you for watching this last part of our notes. At this time, you're going to go to class kick and you're looking for the rabbit and fruit fly graphing activity.